This is an overview of the readings for the first module of the Introduction to Language Documentation and Description course. The topic of this module is Endangered Languages. It's one of two modules that will focus on endangered languages. The emphasis in this module is on making a global assessment of language endangerment. Now, this course is actually about language documentation, not about language endangerment. But of course, language endangerment sets the context for discussing language documentation and description, in particular in the last 30 years. Some of the topics that we're going to cover is why language endangerment is considered a major issue, the question of trying to assess how many languages are endangered, and some of these readings briefly also touch on the related question of how do you assess levels of language endangerment or the counterpart language vitality. In this overview, I'll be talking about the following 8 publications listed here. The first 2 are the minimum reading you should be doing in order to stay engaged in our discussions in this class, but of course you're encouraged to do as many readings as possible. First reading is from 1992 from Krauss. This was a short article published in Language, the Journal of the Linguistic Society of America. This article is often considered the beginning of the current modern emphasis on endangered languages. There were, of course, other publications on language endangerment and language loss before this, but this article is often cited as the galvanizing moment when a critical mass of linguists became more actively interested in the issue of language endangerment. And this article is something of the rallying cry for everyone who got behind the language endangered moment back in the 1990s. The article, as you can see in the name, language endangerment very explicitly makes a link and comparison between language loss and species endangerment from a biological perspective. It also offers an estimate of the global rate of language loss, which became a very influential and often cited estimate of the rate of language loss. And it was very much an article that included a call to action, asking for linguists to respond, to do something, to do both language documentation and also to engage in language maintenance or promoting the survival of endangered languages. One of the influential passages from Krauss 1992, where Krauss gives an estimate of the number of languages that are endangered, is the following. Krauss writes, "Therefore, I consider it a plausible calculation that at the rate things are going, the coming century will see either the death or the doom of 90% of mankind's languages. What are we as linguists doing to prepare for this or to prevent this catastrophic destruction of the linguistic world?" The next reading is from Simons and Lewis, writing 20 years later, very explicitly in response to Krauss's paper, with the goal of updating the statistics that Krauss gave, updating that figure of potentially losing 90% of the languages of the world, and at what rate. Simons and Lewis are both editors for the Ethnolog, and that's where their statistics that they're working with are coming from. You may already be familiar with the Ethnolog, but if not, you should go to ethnolog.com at some point, click around, look around to see what kind of information is out there. If you're trying to access Ethnolog from the UK, it won't be free, so some of the information will be behind a paywall. So you won't be able to access everything, but it's still important to go on there and at least be familiar with what the Ethnolog is and what kind of information it gives for different languages that it has in its catalog. Simons and Lewis spend some time talking about a measurement tool or a scale for measuring or rating linguistic vitality. They call their tool eGIDS or expanded GIDS. GIDS is an acronym taken from a Joshua Fishman paper, 1991, the Graded Intergenerational Disruption Scale, and that's a rating to determine how well or how thoroughly language is being transmitted from generation to generation, how likely it is to continue being spoken. And then they explain their scale and how they applied it to the languages that are in the ethnologue. The results are that 19% of the languages in the world are no longer being learned by children. So these are the languages that are clearly not being transmitted to the next generation at the current moment or as of 2013. However, then they note that there are very strong geographical differences in language vitality. That in areas like Australia, Canada, and the USA, we do see an extinction rate as high as 75% of languages that were spoken in 1950 compared to the languages that are spoken now. But in other parts of the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, the numbers are quite different, and there's less than a 10% extinction rate since 1950 for the languages of sub-Saharan Africa. And they suggest that these numbers provide quantitative support for the observation of Buffoni that language shift is largely predicted by two different types of colonization, where there was settler colonization, and the colonizers stayed and remained and to create new societies, that they also brought language shift with them, but where colonizers were not looking to move to a new area but only to exploit it for its resources, there was less impact on language vitality. A key quote from the Simons and Lewis paper, where they compare their results directly to Krauss. Our findings show that Krauss's estimate in 1992 that 50% of languages were doomed or dying was too dire. 20 years later, we have, for the first time, vitality estimates for all the world's languages. Our finding is that out of 7,103 living languages, 1,360 are not being learned by children. This in no way diminishes the relevance of Krauss's warning, since there are minority languages under threat in all parts of the world. However, on a global scale, the threat does not yet reach the level suggested by Krauss. Another interesting quote we're thinking about from Simons and Lewis, they say that globally, 2,503 of the languages of the world are characterized by vigorous oral use. It's an interesting quote because they are pointing out that about 1/3 of the languages spoken in the world are in a situation where it's actually quite difficult to assess the language vitality. The languages are being spoken orally, so they're not institutionalized, which is something that's often associated with certainty in terms of language vitality. But they're also not showing signs of no longer being transmitted to the next generation, which is the clear sign of moving towards language loss. So many of the languages of the world are spoken in a situation where it's actually quite difficult to predict the vitality of those languages. And that may explain some of the differences we see in assessments between different authors. A related publication included in this list is a poster from Simons, same author, that looks at the same question of the rate of language loss and does so diachronically as well as over geographic areas. So in this poster, it'll show the rate of language change and the amount of language loss in different areas over different time periods. So he compares language diversity in different continents or parts of the world since 1795 and provides a visualization of that diachronic loss from country to country. In the proceedings version of this publication available online, Simons writes, the results of this study show that the current rate of language loss is 9 languages per year, which is a far cry from the widely cited 1 language dies every 14 days. However, If the trajectory of spreading language loss maintains its present course, the rate of language loss is likely to reach that level by the middle of the next century. The next publication is another conference presentation by Campbell et al. From 2013. This presentation discusses another list of endangered languages, the Catalog of Endangered Languages, or LCAT, from the University of Hawaii. You can access the Catalog of Endangered Languages online at endangeredlanguages.com. It's a catalog that only lists endangered languages, so it does not try to include all the languages of the world. This presentation was given at the 3rd International Conference on Language Documentation and Conservation, and the audio from the original presentation is available online. Their conclusion from the analysis of their catalog is that 46% of the languages of the world are endangered, that 227 languages have gone extinct since 1960, and that 100 of 420 language families have disappeared. So they're not only looking at the loss of individual languages, but also the loss of language families. Some of their results can be summed up in this quote from their presentation slides. The frequently repeated claim that one language was extinct each 2 weeks is not supported. LCAT finds that on average, only 0.36 of a language per month becomes extinct. That is about 1 each 3 months, or 4.3 languages per year. And this is true of all periods of time in recent years. So they actually have a predicted rate of language loss that's about half the amount of what Simons and Lewis found. This paper by Rogers and Campbell sums up some of the same information from their conference presentation in 2013, so it's useful looking at as a way to see those results in prose form. It's an entry in Oxford Research Encyclopedia. And the first part is an updated look at endangered language, where they summarize the LCAT results again, emphasizing that 45% of the world's languages are endangered. The rest of the article looks at causes, and they list economic causes, political causes, language attitudes, and the effect of institutions. And they also talk about the response to language loss, and why we should care about it from the perspective of justice, perspective of humanity, of knowledge, and linguistics. A third catalog of languages that's done an assessment of the rate and the effects of language loss around the world is summed up in this paper by Hammerstrom et al. In Language Documentation and Conservation. Harold Hammerstrom is the organizer of Glottolog.org, and that's the database that this particular paper is using to analyze the rate of language loss. If you haven't been to Glottolog.org, you should definitely go online and check it out. It's a freely accessible open access catalog, a list of all of the languages of the world. In this paper, they're announcing a new feature of Glottolog.org called Glottoscope. Glottoscope looks at information about language endangerment, which is taken from the Ethnologue, LCAT, and UNESCO. By combining and analyzing this information, they come up with the following results: that 37% of the languages of the world are definitely not endangered. 18% of the world are said to be threatened, and 44% are said to be shifting, moribund, nearly extinct, or extinct. This new feature of Glottolog not only looks at language vitality, but also provides a quantified summary of the language description of each language. And they provide visualization of language endangerment and language description shown according to the geographic distribution of the languages of the world. So for example, on Glottoscope, we can look at the languages of the Philippines, look at them according to their language vitality, and see color and shape schemes that indicate different levels of language vitality for languages in the Philippines according to where those languages are primarily spoken. The last of the analytical papers we'll look at in this group is a short article by Whalen and Simmons from 2012, looking at the question of endangered language families. Whalen and Simmons divide the languages of the world into 372 linguistic stocks, where a stock is either a group of languages that are shown to be genetically related or a linguistic isolate that is not related to any other language in the world. According to their calculations, 15% of linguistic stocks have gone extinct since 1950. And it's currently the case, or was in 2012 the case, that in 27% of linguistic stocks of the world, none of the languages of that stock are being learned by children, so they are shifting. They also reiterate the idea that languages with fewer speakers are more likely to be endangered, and they provide some quantitative support for this correlation. Whalen and Simmons address the relevance of their findings in this quote. The loss of languages reduces the range of phenomena that linguists can address and makes claims for universal features of language more and more tenuous. The adequacy of our descriptive framework is constantly challenged by work with previously undescribed languages, indicating a fundamental gap in our theorizing. The loss of an entire family can have even more extensive impact on linguistic theorizing. Our final reading is a summary of many of these papers from Musgrave, 2015, an article in the Routledge Handbook of Linguistics on language endangerment. Musgrave provides a helpful summary of much of the literature that we've just discussed in the first two sections of the chapter, and then goes into some detail on comparing language vitality scales. So it looks at some of the scales that are used in these different analyses and explains the differences and similarities. He also brings up the issue of interlanguage variation versus interlanguage variation, pointing out that the distinction between language and dialect is a very subjective one, and it makes it quite difficult to capture what's happening in terms of loss of language diversity if we're only looking at a rather arbitrarily defined category of language and not looking at variation within the groups that are normally called languages. Musgrave also provides a summary of many of the responses to language endangerment and the motivations for how to respond to language endangerment. Some additional readings and longer publications that you might want to consider looking at, especially if you are considering writing one of your assignments about this topic, are Investigating Obsolescence, an early paper on this topic by Dorian. You may want to look at further articles in the Oxford Handbook of Endangered Languages that came out in 2018. There's also a book on endangered languages by Thomason in 2015.